Okay, today we'll be talking about Chapter 21, Section 1, The Changing Ways of Life in America in the 1920s. So first, let's look at the new urban scene. According to a census in 1920, 51.2% of Americans were living in communities of over 2,500 people. That means the trend is showing that America is taking on a more urban population. Now, throughout the 1920s, nearly 2 million people left farms going to towns each year. There were 65 cities with populations of over 100,000 or more. So this leads us to a bit of a cultural quandary. We're having to generalize here since we're talking about a large number of people, but America was going through a cultural change at this time. For one, urban and rural cultures were different. In rural communities, there tend to be close ties, hard work ethics, tend to be strict morals in these small towns. And then in the cities, we see a culture of anonymity. People are moving there to make money, but also to seek entertainment. Now, Prohibition is a great example of this. It's called the Prohibition experiment because though alcohol was made illegal under the 18th Amendment, launching the Prohibition era, and though it was supported primarily by religious groups, often in the rural South, but also in the western United States, who saw a connection between drinking and crime, as well as child abuse and other problems in society. So though this was implemented, the period of Prohibition, outlawing the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol, was heavily opposed primarily by immigrants, anyone who refused to quit drinking, which Americans tend to drink, and many do, in fact. Many of these resented the government meddling in their own personal lives. One of the biggest problems with this is simply that the government did not budget enough money to enforce the law. So here we see a distillery that's been confiscated by revenue agents or would be part of the government's effort to prohibit and discourage Americans from producing, consuming, and distributing alcohol.
They want your sweet, innocent girls to take to booze so they can be enticed into honky-tonks by slick-haired vultures who prey on the flower of American womanhood. I say alcohol must go.
In the decade before the Civil War, many believed that the most dangerous drug in America was alcohol.
So the problem with the outlawing of alcohol is it was in high demand. You could obtain alcohol easily. There was a large black market for it, to the point where you could consume alcohol in illegal bars called speakeasies. These were hidden saloons, sometimes nightclubs, and they were very fashionable. People could go there, they would have to know some kind of secret code or password, and while there they could consume alcohol, buy it, purchase it, and enjoy it, though it was, of course, illegal. Now, people were also creating their own alcohol, distilling liquor from corn, from rye, from wheat, from honey, from anything that has gone through the fermentation process. People were selling prescription alcohol or sacramental wine. These were sort of workarounds or loopholes in the system. And finally, people were simply smuggling alcohol from other countries, from hidden producers in rural areas, and these bootleggers were smuggling it into cities.
It was a scene guaranteed to bring dismay to many in America. People dancing the night away to all sorts of modern music. For more than 2 decades, the temperance movement campaigned against drunkenness and associated behavior. But in January 1920, supporters of temperance got their way. The sale and distribution of alcohol was banned. They called it Prohibition and considered it a noble experiment.
I can't believe that anybody, any right-thinking person today could ever suggest that Prohibition was a noble experiment. Prohibition was one of the worst things that ever happened to this country.
Prohibition gave rise to the bootleg years, and bootlegging led to organized crime. Gangsters and their accomplices were suddenly everywhere, on the streets, in City Hall, in cheap establishments, and in high-class parties.
Prohibition, let's face it, Prohibition is what created the mob.
Gangsters inspired movies, filled newspapers, and bankrolled the new kind of music called jazz. The aim of Prohibition had been to dim the bright lights of Broadway and bring people back to the traditional values of hard work and sobriety. But it backfired. In the period of economic boom that followed World War I, people didn't want sobriety. They wanted fun. Prohibition divided the nation, and half of America went underground. This was once the best-kept secret in Manhattan. In a midtown basement, beneath the bustle of New York's 52nd Street, there lies a hidden treasure from the Roaring '20s. A massive door cut from the brickwork of a neighboring wall and weighing a hefty 4,000 pounds protects a wine cellar. This wine cellar now plays host to upscale soirees and high-powered business lunches. But it started very differently, as part of a speakeasy, the 21 Club. The speakeasy as an American institution was a product of Prohibition, and the 21 Club was the pick of the crop. Speakeasies, or hidden saloons and nightclubs, sold liquor illegally, and thanks to Prohibition, respectable people found themselves on the wrong side of the law. It opened in 1920, and while gangsters never ran the club, its suppliers must have had shady connections.
During Prohibition, the 21 Club was raided several times by federal agents.
So the club's owners deployed a wide range of covert devices to keep the agents at bay.
When they did appear at the front door, a series of bells were pressed and buzzers were sounded, and the shelves, the back shelves, which held bottles of spirits and wines and glassware, flipped upside down. The bottles and glassware went crashing down into the New York City sewer system and a sand pit.
The collapsible shelves have long gone, but the most unusual feature of the club is still in working order: the 4,000-pound secret cellar door.
It was really difficult for federal agents to come in and find the door that is behind me at present. The federal agents did come in and try and find that using matches and other devices, but were never able to find it.
And this is why the police were stumped. The door could be opened only using a special key in a special way.
You would insert this 18-inch skewer in there, trigger the mechanism on the back of the door, and then push open the 4,000-pound door. And in we go.
The 21 Club was a custom-built speakeasy designed for breaking the law. But as a speakeasy, it was far from unique. Across America during the 1920s, no fewer than 200,000 speakeasies opened for business. This is one of New York's oldest bars, Pete's Tavern. But during Prohibition, it too became a speakeasy. And its clientele entered through a fake refrigerator in the back of an adjacent florist. Customers liked the excitement and glamour of visiting a speakeasy, including the possibility of meeting one of the illegal liquor suppliers.
And so here we see a bootlegger which has been caught as a result of a car chase. And again, you see these federal revenue agents exposing the back of this car, which was full of illegal alcohol. Now, again, the trouble with outlawing a product which is in demand is this creates a black market for it. And black market means organized crime. And so Prohibition contributed to organized crime, particularly in major cities, but it was a bit of a nationwide affair. Some notable names, such as Al Capone, managed to control entire cities through the liquor business, sometimes by killing off competitors, sometimes through normal business practices such as mergers and buyouts and takeovers. Now, by the mid-1920s, only a small percent of Americans even supported Prohibition, and it was finally repealed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment.
Crime in those years was fueled by the speakeasies that served up illegal booze, and the millions who patronized these establishments treated Prohibition as a joke. Texas Guinan, queen of the speakeasies, scorned not only the law, but her own customers.
Before I start to sing this song, I want it understood that no sucker in this room has been a mention of how it works. I'll rave and swear and tear my hair because I'm going to kill that bum that wrote that song entitled California, Here I Come. Now, Mayor Walker wrote another song. And then he gave the music to the policeman's band to play. He dedicated it to Warren, and the song sure is a wow. It goes, I used to love you, but it's over,
Prohibition agents did raid illegal breweries, and some of the product was destroyed. But many agents took payoffs and looked the other way rather than close a speakeasy or an illegal distillery. In fact, the mayor of Chicago said half of the Chicago police force was criminally involved. For Chicago gang lord Al Capone, payoffs were hardly a problem. His personal income was estimated at millions per year. It was easier and safer for Prohibition agents to pick on the small-time moonshiners. There was a war going on, and there were mountains of illegal weapons to prove it. So many arms were seized that authorities had to dispose of them at sea. Coast Guardsmen chased rum runners bringing liquor in from Canada and the Caribbean, and many arrests were made. Even so, almost anyone who wanted premium whiskey could get it at a price. Prohibition, once called the noble experiment, was clearly an ignoble disaster. Across the nation, people paraded in the streets demanding repeal of the 18th Amendment. The protesters insisted that repeal would bring the Depression to an end. In New York, Mayor Jimmy Walker led a massive demonstration. Like millions of Americans, the demonstrators believed that legalizing beer and liquor would divert money from the gangsters to businessmen, who would then be able to create jobs for the unemployed. But these arguments had no effect on Herbert Hoover. The president defended Prohibition as staunchly as ever, though his stubbornness was sealing the doom of his administration.
So, the next topic in our cultural transition that we're going to discuss is American fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is a movement based on a literal interpretation of the Bible. Those who view religion in this way tend to be skeptical of major scientific discoveries or theories that contradict their beliefs, particularly the theory of evolution. Fundamentalists rejected this theory outright. Fundamentalists believe that all important knowledge can be found in the Bible. Preachers subscribing to this brand of Christianity were leading religious revivals throughout the South and the West. Some notable names, Billy Sunday or Amy Semple McPherson were famous for preaching this brand of Christianity around the nation. Perhaps the most famous example of fundamentalist opposition of evolution is the 1925 Tennessee Scopes trial, known as the Monkey Trial. In 1925, Tennessee passed a law making it a crime to teach evolution. And the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, backed a young science teacher named John Scopes. He agreed to challenge the law and receive free legal counsel from the ACLU. The ACLU hired the most famous trial lawyer of the country, Clarence Darrow, to defend this young science teacher, John Scopes. Darrow was typically supported by secular thinkers and those who saw the theory of evolution as the most practical answer for the complexity of organisms on Earth. These people did not believe that the Bible should be interpreted literally and were concerned about the growing power of fundamentalists. So here's a picture of Clarence Darrow on the left and William Jennings Bryan on the right. Bryan was brought in for the prosecution.
43 years after his death, Darwin was in the headlines all across America. They called it the Scopes Monkey Trial.
Dateline, Dayton, Tennessee, July 11th, 1925. In a moment, the story.
Young John Scopes was charged with teaching evolution in his public school classroom. Perennial presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan rose from his sickbed to rally the prosecution. Defending Scopes was the equally famous Clarence Darrow.
On the day of the trial, a full house of avid spectators from all over the nation filed in to hear the debate. The issue was no longer the innocence or guilt of Scopes, but rather the final death struggle between two basic human philosophies, fundamentalism versus modernism.
In the end, Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. The verdict was overturned on a technicality, but the law stayed on the books in Tennessee until 1967.
The Scopes trial was just as farcical as some of the trials today in which teachers are ordered not to teach the creation model. A teacher should be allowed to teach any and all perspectives of truth. It's been our experience that when we do that openly and fairly, creation wins hands down.
That people would prefer miracles to a simple natural law puzzles some researchers and angers others.
That 47% of the American population doesn't believe in evolution is a very frightening statistic. It's frightening from an educator's point of view because it denies the basic unifying principle of biology, which is, to paraphrase it, nothing in biology makes sense except from an evolutionary perspective.
Darwinism has more than its fair share of skepticism, and it's rather hard to see why that should be. Part of the problem is that people are simply ignorant of it. I mean, it's an astonishing thing, but it's true about our educational system, that we teach children just about everything except this really certain fact that we now know, which is why we exist. I believe that there is no other explanation for the kind of elegant, apparently design complexity that we call life, that indeed defines life.
Darwin was careful to suggest that a creator might have started the whole process, breathing life into the first organisms. But the simple fact is, God wasn't absolutely necessary in a Darwinian universe. Supernatural intervention was replaced by natural selection. It was perhaps a more logical world. It was certainly lonelier.
to speak on the Bible. Now, the main supporters of the prosecution were Protestant fundamentalists. They believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible and did not want their children learning evolution. And so this is the Scopes trial. It became more than what it was. John Scopes broke the Tennessee law and he was fined and sent on his way. But it became a debate about the role of science and religion in public schools. It became a debate about evolution itself. It was a national sensation. Thousands attended the trial, people read about the trial, and it represented this national discussion which was going on about the role of science and religion in schools. Now, in the end, Bryan admitted that the Bible was open to interpretation. In fact, Clarence Darrow called up William Jennings Bryan to the stand. And he said, "Mr. Bryan, I'm going to ask you a series of questions. I need you to reply honestly and to remember that you're under oath." And he said, "Okay." So he said, "Do you believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible?" Bryan said, "Yes." "Do you believe that the earth was created in 6 literal days?" "Yes." "Well, do you agree with Bishop Ussher's calculations that according to the Bible, the earth was created roughly 6,000 years ago?" And he said, "Yes." And then he said, "Well, what about recent archaeological findings that predate this time period?" And this is one of those dramatic moments in a court scene where William Jennings Bryan was at a loss for words and was forced to admit by the famous trial lawyer that the Bible could be open to interpretation.